We resume our studies of the book of Ezra today at chapter 4. But before we go any further, a brief history lesson is in order before we study it, because although it doesn't take long to read the events described here, they covered a period of 16 years. Rebuilding of the temple, as we've already seen, commenced in 534 BC, about 2 years after the people first came back from their time in exile. However, this work was stopped shortly afterwards and not resumed, as verse 24 tells us, until 520 BC. The account of this chapter is otherwise fairly self-explanatory, but the intention lying behind the telling of the story by the author is that we should learn some important lessons from it ourselves. So we note that the passage implies that often when we go forward to do God's work, it will be challenged. The Bible repeatedly reminds us that spiritual progress is often only ever achieved in the heat of battle against powerful enemy forces. And this becomes very apparent here. First of all, no sooner had the people begun the work of rebuilding the temple than they were surrounded by apparently insuperable problems. Powerful enemies approached them from every side, as verses 4 and 5 demonstrate. Secondly, we notice that this opposition was sustained. Opposition began during the reign of Cyrus, was sustained through the rule of Artaxerxes, and was not overcome until Darius was crowned. Meanwhile, the work on the temple was placed in limbo. Nothing or very little was accomplished at all. Thirdly, we notice that sometimes any hope of progress seems to get dashed. Verse 23 may suggest that some attempts had been made to resume the work, but this had been immediately stopped. Far from progress being made, it seemed to be a case of one step forward and 2 steps back. And finally, for a long time, as we've seen, 16 years, it seemed as though the opponents of God's people had achieved complete victory. What a thorough reverse after what appeared the exciting climax of chapter 2. Yet if we find this unexpected, it only goes to show how superficially we've read our Bibles. The Christian life, whether as communities or individuals, is a battle, and immediate success is nowhere guaranteed. This passage reminds us that we have to enter Christian service both forewarned and forearmed. It is interesting to notice that this chapter identifies 5 different types of difficulty. There was the repeated temptation to compromise, as we see in verse 3, and discouragement and constant frustration, as we find in verses 4 and 5. Then, as well as unremitting opposition, there was misrepresentation by powerful enemies who could be violent and destructive, as we've already seen in verse 23. And we notice too that seldom was there only one problem at one time. But if there were difficulties created by enemies to God and his people, problems were also created by the faint-hearted among the people of God. We might compare again Nehemiah chapter 4 verse 10. And there were those with long memories of failure on other battlefields, as we see in Haggai chapter 2. And they tended to discourage going forward. Doing the work for God, this chapter suggests, is seldom easy. There are constant troubles that are liable to drain the strength of God's workers. The memory of the experience of his presence, so powerfully demonstrated in chapter 2 verse 13, has often to be carried into many deep and very dark valleys. Yet, as we shall see, the dark valley is never the end of the road. It is imperative then that we are realists. God is for us, but that does not mean that the path is free from thorns and thickets. Through suffering, God brings his people to glory, just as he did with Jesus.